Ahoy! Today we are talking about technology. And there's a reason for that. So, as you may be aware, I've been following the developments of AMD relatively closely because I'm very interested in what's happening in that market, and I think what is happening there is interesting for pretty much everyone who's interested in gaming. PC gamers as well as console gamers, there's a lot happening in that regard at the moment that I think is worth following. And if you've not been paying attention to this at all, AMD basically was almost out of the market for a while and then came back relatively strong with their new CPU lineup with Ryzen, which in its first generation was still a bit rough around the edges, but has since established itself as a very strong CPU for gaming as well as streaming and all that kind of stuff around it. So it's become a lot more popular than before. And yeah, the consequence of that is basically that AMD is now trying to do the same thing with graphics cards. And I think that's very interesting and worth talking about and looking at where they're going with this. So AMD has been making graphics cards for a long time. But as of recent, or with basically the announcement yesterday, they are pushing much more heavily in the top-end market. Before that, they were mostly interested in making the better value graphics cards and not so much the top end. But now they said, okay, we want to go all in. We want to establish ourselves as a main force in this market as well. And it's looking pretty interesting. It's looking pretty promising so far. So I want to talk about that, and I want to talk about the implication for us gamers. So the generation is the RX 6000 graphics cards, and the architecture that run on the structure behind this is called RDNA2. They are actually already working on RDNA3, which is meant to come out before 2022, but that's another story for another day. And I got a bit of a presentation based on the slides that they had, basically. We're not going to go through everything they had because it's really, really long. But I wanted to show you a little bit of the stats here, or the performance rather, because I think that's at the end of the day what we look at when we buy components, less so than individual aspects of what they offer, because honestly, I realistically don't really know what's behind all the cryptic numbers and stuff that they give you. I think that's more for people that are deep in the technology, but I want to see the end result, and that is what they present us with. Now keep in mind with all these graphs, especially that they are made by AMD, so I wouldn't trust them 100% because they're not an independent source. But it's worth mentioning that apparently, as of late, AMD has been relatively accurate with their charts, representing the performance, and often rather lowballing a little bit. And the actual results apparently often look better in the end than what they showed here. But we'll have to wait for independent reviews for that. But let's take a bit of a first look here. So the first one is the RX 6800 XT. So this is the graphics card that's meant to compete with the Nvidia RTX 3080, so second highest end graphics card, so to speak. And this one looks very similar here in terms of performance on 4K. You have to keep in mind that on 4K, basically graphics cards get pushed to their limits. That's where you can see the performance of a graphics card the best, but that's not necessarily what everyone uses. And what's also interesting for this one is there is a secondary graph here. By the way, the one on the right here is Shadow of Tomb Raider and Wolfenstein. Shadow of Tomb Raider and Wolfenstein, Youngblood. This is for 1440p gaming. And here we can see that, again, the margin between the two graphics cards is very, very close. And what we'll see later is that for other tests, they actually activated special boosters. We'll get to that. But for these tests, they didn't activate anything. And the reason why these are so close in performance and why Radeon or AMD is still promoting that is because the price gap between these graphics cards will also be relatively low. So the Radeon graphics card here, the 6800, it sounds so weird to say to me as a German, but 6800 will be $649, whereas the Nvidia equivalent will be $699. So you save $50, and that's why they can kind of show these stats and say, yo, it's close enough, but we're cheaper. But that's not the only market they want to go into. They also have a more budget version, which is not really that budget, which is more aiming towards people that want to go a little bit cheaper, and is compared with the RTX 2080 Ti, so the last generation, but the top end of the last generation, so to speak. And you can see that the performance is significantly higher in this case. That's what they want to promote here. Like, we have this Neo graphics card is way better than the last generation Nvidia. And they do use smart access memory here, though, which is worth pointing out, which is essentially a mechanic that increases the performance of any Radeon graphics card, of the new ones, if you also have an AMD CPU. So that gives you roughly a 5% performance boost, I said. So it should still be above this without it for most games, except Division 2. But I think it's worth noting that this makes the comparison a little bit unfair, but then at the same time, if you buy a system with this graphics card, you're probably going to buy a new gen AMD with that, very likely, if you're looking to fully upgrade. And then there is, and the price difference here is pretty huge. The 6800 will be $579, whereas the 2080 Ti used to be $999, even though it's obviously not necessarily that expensive anymore. Price dropped a lot and are all over the place, with the new cards being announced but not really being available and all that stuff. And then they have the frontline killer, so to speak, which is the RX 6900 XT. Quick overview of the stats here. I just want to show it once, and like I said, I can't really tell you much from these stats. So that's what they're promoting themselves with, so to speak. But the really interesting part to me is this, the benchmarks. And here we can see smart access memory is used once again to get a little bit of leverage. They are, no, never mind, this is the wrong graph. This is not the one I wanted to get to. This is the one. Here, rage mode and smart access mode memory. This is actually another performance boost. The rage mode is essentially a one-click overclock, they call it, to max out your system without having to do anything else. So technically speaking, you're kind of comparing an overclocked value to a normal value here. And you can see that this is compared to the RTX 3090. And in some games, Nvidia looks a little bit better here. Doom, for example. In others, Radeon ends up looking better. AMD looks better, like Forza. So it depends a lot on optimization of the game at that point, which I think is generally an interesting point, that at some point it's sometimes less the performance of the graphics card itself as much as is the developer of a game deciding we want to optimize for that graphics card, or this is the focus for us. But the interesting point, and why they're doing this comparison with all these things activated, is because the 6900 XT comes at a price point of $999, whereas the 3090 comes at a price point of $1,499. So you're saving $500. If that's effectively going to be the case, because one of them might be sold out or the other might be pulled down in price because of this competition, is another story. These graphics cards all come out between the 5th of next month and the 8th of December, so right for the Christmas market, basically. And they are definitely meant to put the heat on Nvidia. Now, I will say that I think at this point, that's not necessarily gonna lead to massive heat being put on Nvidia. If you, for example, compare the 69 and the 6800 here, you can see that realistically, let's see, where's the 4K version? The performance here, Doom Eternal, we get 138 on the 68 and then 150 on the 69. So it's not even a massive difference at that point anymore. You really want to squeeze out on top, and you pay a lot more. And that's the same with Nvidia. And they are also still going up a lot in price. The cheapest one here is still $579, which is not the typical budget version that you would expect from AMD. So it's a shift, but this shift allows them to at least have a little bit of price competition with Nvidia. They're not really pushing down prices as much as they used to in the past, or as much as they do with the Ryzen. But at the same time, if Nvidia then decides to lower their prices, they will probably still have some some room to lower their prices below that. I feel like that's what they're calculating for. So I think a very interesting approach and very good for us, because more competition means lower prices, means better products, and everything else that comes with that, as long as competition exists and no one gets pushed out essentially, or no one says this market is not interesting for us anymore, we're going to go into servers or something. And what I think is worth noting also is there are still things that are not quite there. So AMD announced a lot of features, like I said, the rage mode, the one-click overclock, or the smart access memory that improves your performance. They also announced a latency reduction feature. If you have a FreeSync monitor and you use AMD Radeon Boost, then you can get up to 23 milliseconds latency reduction, like from your mouse click to your screen, so to speak. But this only works for a few select games. Because really, I think most games at the moment are working more closely with Nvidia. And there's all the other things or the other features that are just different. Like you have DirectX ray tracing, but you don't have the RTX in that sense as Nvidia has it, as far as I understand it. The focus is different. You have more of a focus on performance per watt. But that's, on the other hand, is going to be interesting for laptops, for example. Like, just using less electricity is pretty good. Or getting more of the electricity that you use if you're using a battery. And yeah, the other features there, for example, Nvidia has something called DLSS. I forgot what it stands for. It's some neural learning, essentially. Something that enhances pictures, and AMD is working on something similar, which they're currently testing. And it would be open and cross-platform if it comes out. Or when it comes out, but it will only come out after the launch of these graphics cards. They couldn't finish it in time. Then there's also NVENC, which I think is pretty important, which is an encoder for streaming. And I think most people that stream are familiar with this. You have your X264 encoder, which is the one that uses your CPU. And typically that puts quite a heavy strain on your CPU. And it's not exactly ideal for streaming because the quality is not necessarily good unless you choose very specific encoding options. And NVENC, on the other hand, which also used to be a shadow play and everything, but also works in OBS now, is a lot easier to work with and delivers very high quality and at reasonable workload on your graphics card. So there are certain features that you miss out on if you go with Radeon. You also don't get access to the new stuff that Nvidia is working on, like RTX voice and everything surrounding that. And I think that leads to a situation where maybe the graphics cards are, well, comparable in performance, but unless you have a very specific reason to go with Radeon, I would not go with them this generation. Because what I've learned from me buying the first generation of Ryzen was that a lot of improvements happened between the first generation and the second generation. And essentially you're a bit of a guinea pig testing if everything works out right. And you will also have to deal with the shortcomings of those very CPUs, the performance not always being where you want it to be in certain games and so on and so on. And I feel like that's going to be the case with these graphics cards, right? In this generation, they're like on the same level as Nvidia, but you're also paying almost the same. $50 if you're spending more than 500, yeah, it's still more of an investment, but you're already spending a lot at that point. It hurts less to spend just that little bit more, that 10% more. So you're taking more of a risk by buying a Radeon graphics card this generation, I think, unless later benchmarks show us that the performance is actually way higher than was shown here and way higher than we expected, and people can squeeze way more out of it. But you also don't know how many developers are going to optimize it for it just yet, really. And again, there's a lot of features that AMD doesn't really offer to the same degree just yet as current Nvidia graphics cards do that, given how long they've been in the game as well. So it's a lot more established. But what I feel is going to happen is that the next generation is going to be super interesting based on this. They're going to improve the architecture further. They're going to have all those features that they're currently still working on. Maybe it's even going to be the RDNA2 and they're going to have this new technology along with it again. All of that is going to come together. And depending on what Nvidia puts out, they may very well outcompete Nvidia at that point, outperform Nvidia at that point. And that is when things become really interesting, because that's when a lot more game developers will also have caught up and be like, okay, we're developing more targeted towards AMD now, because they've been showing that everything works together. And also, we're having more and more people buy Ryzen as their main CPUs. So with them buying the newer generations that work directly with the graphics card, there's also going to be a higher interest in doing that. And then you get another performance boost, and you get the idea. It goes on and on. So really, I think this is just, a starting point, a very interesting one. But I think it's very good in the sense that it could build up to a very high potential in the future. And what's also worth noting, what I learned recently, is that all the consoles, all the next-gen consoles are basically powered by AMD. The graphics cards for both the PS5 and the Xbox Series X and S are all AMD, and I think the CPUs as well, or at least partially or something. So everything that gets developed has to, some degree, has to cater to AMD, has to work well with AMD, because you're gonna have the console version of it. And both the Xbox as well as the PS5 are using this RDNA2 structure as well. So you basically design with that in mind, and that should result in relatively good performance even now already. But again, I think as a PC gamer, it makes more sense to wait maybe for the next generation. But I think this is a very interesting topic. I think this is a very interesting field, and I hope the competition stays up, goes up there, because really we can just benefit if competitions fight. Then we are the winners of that in any regard. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope this was interesting, insightful. If you're new to the channel, feel sub button and make the bell. Really helps me out. And other than that, I hope to see you for the next one soon. ZiSotto, out.